I haven't had a chance to work on my new 20-inch bandsaw this week, so instead I'll talk about my old 18-inch bandsaw that I finished 6.5 years ago and things I learned in the process of building that. This all started with a little 9-inch bandsaw that I saw at a yard sale when I was on my bike. So I paid the guy and came back later in the day by car, but the bandsaw was gone and the guy said he sold it. He sold it to somebody else, so I took payment twice. I got my money back, but I was so frustrated by this I decided to build my own bandsaw. But instead of building a small one, I figured it would make much more sense to build a big one. The very first part of this bandsaw that I built was actually this pulley, and I actually cut the groove for that on the table saw. And that pulley allowed me to spin up this shaft, and then with the bottom wheel mounted on the shaft, I was able to trim that up like on a lathe with a chisel. I also mounted the top wheel on the same bottom shaft, locking it to the bottom shaft so I could trim it the same way, and that's how I made the first set of wheels. Once I had the wheels built, I clamped them to a long piece of wood and put a blade on them, and once I was able to get that to track, I was pretty confident that this bandsaw would work. The frame is made out of some thick pieces of wood coming from an old government desk. This one is quite thick. For the top part, it's not as thick, and then those were screwed to a post that came out of a pallet, and that post was initially only this thick because I realized even if I were to put 300 pounds of blade tension on there, over this distance, a piece of wood this thick would easily hold that force. Once I decided on the blade length, I realized this post was actually a little bit too short to reach the top of the saw, so I box jointed another piece of wood onto it to extend it. But once I started playing around with the saw, I realized it wasn't about strength, it was more about stiffness, and this post was too flexible, so I glued another layer on here, and I also added another layer to the back here to stiffen up the middle of it. I initially wasn't going to have any sort of rubber tire on the wheels, and I just ran a 1/2-inch blade straight on the bare wood, and that worked well enough. It was a bit noisy, but when I put a 1/4-inch blade on there, it actually started to dig into the wood a little bit. So then I experimented. First I glued on a rubber layer, but that didn't work all that well. But stretching a bicycle inner tube over the wheels, that really worked. A weakness of this design is that centrifugal force throws dust behind the inner tube and it tends to accumulate in here, so every once in a while I have to clean it out. I think this wheel is particularly bad at this because the wheel is thinner and then it has a thicker flange towards the edge, so the dust kind of falls along here, gets deflected outwards and behind the tube. So since then I've made all my wheels the same thickness throughout so I don't have this extra ledge in here. But the faster you run a bandsaw like this, the more likely you're going to get dust behind the inner tubes. Now my top wheel didn't turn out as good as the bottom wheel. It was made out of really terrible plywood, and instead of these blocks on the side here, I actually just glued a strip of thinner plywood on there and trimmed that down, and all that was just really messy. It also had 2 cast iron bearing flanges that were firmly bolted on either side, but the problem is if I tensioned this saw, say, to 200 pounds, you have 200 pounds pulling that way, but as the wheel turns, it's pulling always down, which is in a different direction with respect to the wheel, and that caused the bearing flanges to just work their way loose eventually. So I knew gluing on wooden bearing flanges, that would actually fix the problem. So I decided to make a new upper wheel, but the problem is I couldn't put it on the shaft for the bottom wheel anymore because by that time I cut it to length and it wasn't sticking out on either side anymore. So I needed a different way of spinning up the upper wheel without being in the bandsaw so I could use a chisel against it to turn it. And so I made this temporary pulley, which I've used on every bandsaw build ever since. I bolted that to one of the flanges, this used to be solid in the middle, and then put a pulley on that to a small motor, and that was able to spin the wheel on its own bearings and laid it down so it was precise. Now that approach had worked so well, I decided to use the same method to spin up this pulley with another temporary pulley on there, so I could then use a chisel and lathe this groove so it was nice and precise. Now while I was turning the groove on this pulley, at some point I got my chisel snagged in here, which brought it to a very rapid stop. Now my pulley at the time was only attached to a shaft with a big wooden screw sort of acting like a set screw here and on here, but getting that chisel snagged and this big wheel acting like a flywheel, I had all the torque from this wheel transfer it through those set screws onto here, and that caused the screw that was in here to shear off. So coupling the pulleys to the shaft rigidly enough is a major problem. To solve that problem, I ended up gluing this wheel onto the shaft because This wheel has a lot of sideways forces on there, so I wanted that to be really, really rigid, but I left that screw in place. And then on the back, I ground the keyway into the shaft with an angle grinder, and I cut a keyway into this wood here with a jigsaw, and then I took this screw and I ground the main part of it square, and I hammered it in here, and this way with the screw head on here I could still pull it out. I've avoided this whole problem on every bandsaw I've built since then by just having this pulley screwed directly to the back of the bottom wheel, and then they both rotate on some bearings on a non-rotating shaft just like the top wheel, and I don't have to worry about how to couple either of them to the shaft. I didn't have any stiff enough springs for a tension spring to move the upper wheel up and down, so I decided to instead use a lever like this and then two big springs like this, and to tension those I came up with this winch contraption. And that works really good, but the whole mechanism is just too complicated. This mechanism is also a little bit dangerous because if I try to release the tension, I have to pull back this part here and then slowly let this out like that. And one time it slipped in my hand and then it spun against my hand and I hurt myself. So I added this lever which can engage with some of these teeth to allow me to manipulate this wheel without having to touch the teeth. So clever as it is, it was just too dangerous and too complicated. And in all my bandsaws since then, I just used two pieces of wood as a spring and then a screw with a crank against here. And it's actually very quick to tension and detension it like that, so that's a much better solution. For the blade guides, I initially used two roller skate bearings running against the blade like this, but that was really noisy and the bearings wear out really quick because they have to run super fast that way. Some say, well, you just need to adjust it so there's a gap between the bearings and the blade so the bearings don't always spin, but then the bearings aren't really guiding the blade. So I found just a wooden block was a much better solution. And these ones are just made out of maple, and these are the very original blocks that actually made as blade guides for the saw. I've had to trim them back a little bit since then, but they've lasted for a very long time. I still use a roller skate bearing for the thrust bearing in the back, but I haven't adjusted so the blade doesn't normally touch that. So this bearing only spins while I'm cutting, and the fact that it makes a lot of noise for that doesn't really matter because the blade makes a lot more noise while I'm cutting. There's no forward and back adjustment on these ones. I just figured I would adjust the tracking of the blade to put it in the right place, and that's worked out fairly well on this saw so far. But then again, I only ever used it with a 1/4 inch blade and with a 1/2 inch blade. The upper blade guide only goes up so far, but to get more resaw height I can reconfigure it and put it straight into the case. And with the guides all the way up to the table, I get about 10.5 inches or about 27 centimeters worth of resaw height. I've used this saw to mill up some heavy logs many times, and to make that easier I eventually added this extension here to the table, and that's actually just box joined onto part of the frame for this bandsaw, and it attaches to the base, and that really helps to support heavy pieces of log as I push them through the saw. A problem with this design of frame is that the wheel up here is offset from this piece of plywood, and that means as it's pulling down here it wants to torque it this way a little bit, which has a tendency to twist this piece of plywood just a little bit. For that reason I used something fairly thick and I doubled it up where I could, here and here, but it's still twisted a tiny bit. So I just made this diagonal brace to go on the back to counteract that. I could mitigate this problem by releasing the blade tension when I'm not using it, but if a bandsaw can't take constant blade tension, then it's just junk. And on any bandsaw that I've built ever since, I made a massive laminated wooden beam here that goes from the bottom wheel to the top wheel, and that's so massive it just won't twist. The fact that my biggest bandsaw is actually kind of an obsolete design has bugged me for the last 5 or 6 years, which is why I'm building this one, and it's bigger, and this one can take real sawmill blades like you would use in a horizontal bandsaw mill, and these were sent to me by sawblade.com. But obsolete as this old bandsaw is, I keep on using it because having debugged it, it just keeps on working, so why not keep using it?